Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're plunging directly into the absolute chaos of the ancient world. Picture this for a second. You're looking at a map of the Roman Empire. It's vast, it's overwhelmingly powerful, and honestly, to the people living inside its borders, it feels totally invincible. But then, the unthinkable happens. The city of Rome, the so-called Eternal City, is attacked, sacked, and left burning by the Goths. It was a moment that quite literally sent shockwaves through the entire ancient world, forcing everyone to question the stability of civilizations they thought would last forever. So let's dive right into this. When the dust finally settled on those ruined streets, a pretty desperate question started echoing among the survivors. How on earth could this happen? And maybe more importantly, whose fault is it? Human nature hasn't really changed much, so people immediately started pointing fingers. For a lot of Romans, the scapegoat was obvious. It was Christianity. They basically argued that because the empire had abandoned its traditional pagan gods, well, those gods had abandoned Rome. Enter Augustine of Hippo. He watches this whole blame game unfolding and decides to write a response, this massive, towering work called The City of God. But in Book 1, which is what we're digging into today, Augustine doesn't just play defense. He completely flips the script. He asks a much larger, far more profound question. What does a catastrophe actually prove? Think about it. If innocent and guilty people suffer the exact same disaster, what does that really mean? Section 1. Rome falls. Who is blamed? The accusation against Christianity. Augustine kicks things off with a genuinely fascinating observation about the attack itself. During this brutal sack of Rome, Christian churches actually became places of sanctuary. People ran into them for protection, and the invaders, who surprisingly held some reverence for these Christian spaces, actually spared the people hiding inside. And here is the wild, ironic twist. That protection was extended to everybody. That included the pagans who were fleeing the violence. Augustine points out that some of the very people who survived because they hid in a Christian holy place later turned around and blamed Christianity for the city's destruction. No way, right? He contrasts this with Rome's own historical traditions. Just think about the fall of Troy. In ancient warfare, pagan temples were absolutely not safe zones. They basically became scenes of horrific killing and plunder. The brutal destruction of Rome was just the grim standard custom of ancient war. What was actually highly unusual, Augustine argues, was the unexpected mercy found in those Christian sanctuaries. Section 2. The mystery of shared suffering. Why do the innocent and guilty suffer together? Now, a critic back then might reasonably ask, okay, if God is so just, why did the Christians suffer right alongside the pagans during the attack? Why did the rain fall on the entire city equally? Augustine's answer here is honestly one of the most brilliant insights of Book I. He argues that the exact same external event does not necessarily have the same meaning for every single person who experiences it. Good people and bad people can go through the exact same terrifying ordeal, suffer the exact same material loss. But the event itself doesn't define them. Your external circumstances do not dictate your internal meaning or your character. To really drive this home, Augustine uses this fantastic analogy of a refiner's fire. The circumstance is exactly the same for everything inside it. Fire and intense pressure. But the outcome? That depends entirely on the subject. If you put gold into that furnace, the fire refines it, right? It burns away the impurities. But if you throw worthless material into that exact same fire, it just completely consumed and destroyed. For Augustine, suffering is universal across the board, but a person's character dictates the actual results. One person might face a horrific disaster and become hopelessly bitter. Another might face that identical disaster and develop profound patience and unbreakable faith. Circumstances alone don't determine who you are. They merely reveal who you are. Section 3. What can you actually lose? The illusion of permanent possessions. Look, we can't sugarcoat it. The physical devastation in Rome was undeniable. People lost literally everything. Homes were completely destroyed, generations of family wealth vanished overnight, and property was looted by the Goths. It was a total material collapse. But Augustine asks a deeply provocative, almost uncomfortable question. If someone loses everything they own, have they truly lost everything that actually matters? He makes a key distinction here. Having wealth is not the same thing as worshiping wealth. Augustine doesn't actually think money is automatically evil. Instead, he points to the biblical figure of Job, a guy who lost absolutely all of his possessions, but completely refused to let that loss break his spirit or his faith. The real danger, Augustine warns, isn't owning things. The danger is allowing those possessions to possess you. Disaster basically acts as a brutal stress test. When the temporary things disappear, like the defensive walls of Rome or, say, your bank account, you suddenly discover just how permanent a place you had given them in your heart. Your character and your faith, he argues, are the only true possessions an invading army can never strip away. Section 4. Violence, Guilt, and Consent. Reclaiming dignity in the wake of atrocity. We have to touch on something incredibly difficult here. The realities of war are terrifying. They bring death, captivity, and horrific sexual assault. Many women, including Christian women, were assaulted during the sack of Rome. And in the ancient world, this carried an immense, crushing social stigma for the victim. But Augustine steps in and offers a genuinely radical redefinition of innocence for his time. He creates an ironclad distinction between violence and consent. If a victim is forced and does not consent, the moral guilt belongs entirely, 100%, to the perpetrator. He argues that moral purity belongs to the will, to the mind and heart, not to what another person can forcibly do to your physical body. Augustine writes this incredibly powerful line: the crime belongs to the person who chooses it, not to the person who suffers it. He uses this to radically challenge the whole traditional Roman mindset. See, the Romans loved the story of Lucretia, a noblewoman who tragically died by suicide after being assaulted, which their culture praised as the ultimate act of honor. Augustine completely rejects that. He asks a very logical question. If she was innocent of the assault, why should an innocent person be punished by her own hand? He tells the survivors of Rome's collapse that they should feel absolutely zero shame for surviving another person's horrific crime. Their dignity remains completely, fundamentally intact. Section 5. Putting Rome on trial. The true cause of collapse. Okay, so Rome had tried to put Christianity on trial, right? Well, now Augustine puts Rome on the stand. He argues that Rome's collapse wasn't caused by abandoning a few pagan gods. It was caused by its own deep internal moral rot. Long before the Goths ever breached those city gates, Rome was decaying from the inside out. I mean, just look at the track record: unchecked ambition, widespread greed, a total obsession with luxury, and endless political violence. But the absolute capstone of it all is what Augustine calls the lust for rule. It's this deeply ingrained, toxic desire to dominate others. Rome was so hyper-obsessed with power and earthly glory that it just hollowed itself out morally. Augustine is actually pretty sharply critical of those who survived this massive catastrophe only to immediately go right back to their old, corrupt vices. He warns that if a disaster teaches you nothing, then the opportunity for moral reflection has been totally wasted. A society's true health, he says, isn't measured by whether its fancy marble walls are still standing, especially if its morals collapsed years ago. So the most important question isn't how do we quickly rebuild Rome? The real question we should all be asking is, what kind of people will actually inhabit this rebuilt city? Section 6. The Tale of Two Cities. Where does your ultimate loyalty lie? All of this brilliantly sets up the core concept that shapes the entire rest of this massive book: the existence of two overlapping cities. On one side, we have the earthly city. It's built on military victory and earthly power. Its lifespan is strictly temporary. It is literally destined to fall, just exactly like Rome did. Its ultimate value is the love of self and the desire for domination. But on the other side, we have the city of God. Its foundation is faith, humility, and virtue. It is permanent, it's invincible, and its ultimate value is the love of truth. But here is the major catch. Right now, in the messy, day-to-day reality of human history, these two cities are completely mixed together. You can't just point to a map to find them. The true division in humanity isn't political, and it isn't geographical. It's not about being Roman versus barbarian, or rich versus poor. The deepest dividing line in history runs right through the human heart. It is defined entirely by what people ultimately love, trust, and live for. That and only that is what determines which city you truly belong to. Section 7. Conclusion. What does a falling city reveal? So, Augustine took this very specific, absolutely terrifying historical disaster, and he used it to ask these huge universal questions about security, loss, and human dignity. Earthly success is just not the measure of truth. Empires are always going to rise and fall. Wealth will disappear. Political power will constantly change hands. If your entire identity is tied up in the earthly city, well, you're going to collapse right alongside it. But Augustine challenges us to look deeper. He asks, what actually remains when an earthly city falls? It's a pretty haunting question, isn't it? One that forces us to look way beyond our own temporary empires and seek out a foundation that no invading army can ever conquer. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer. See you next time.